We are in the book of Micah. We dealt with an introductory look at the book last week, and we're going to continue with the questions this evening. 735 BC is the time in which this book was written, and during that particular time period. He mentions three kings of Judah, which probably means he's prophesying to the people of Jerusalem. And we've seen Hosea prophesying in the times of the northern kingdom, and of course the northern kingdom is going to come to an end in 722. So Micah speaks about the northern kingdom, but looks ahead that will include problems that Judah will have, following the same steps as Israel does. What prophet is contemporary with him? He's probably a younger contemporary of what major prophet? Isaiah. So Isaiah and Micah and Isaiah go together real well. The difference we saw is that Isaiah is dealing with probably the rulers. He's dealing with probably the hierarchy, that type. And Micah, we don't know exactly what his occupation was, but he's sure familiar with the various cities around Jerusalem, around Judah. He's familiar with the countryside. And so some have said, well, he's talking to the people. He knows that people are being mistreated by the ruling class. So Isaiah is dealing with the ruling class. Micah is condemning the ruling class because he understands what it is to be a common people and how the people are suffering because of the fact that they're turning away from God. Kings and Chronicles, you can read the historical samples that we talk about in the passages. Jeremiah confirms Micah. Of course, Jeremiah comes a little bit later, and he uses a principle that Micah had that Hezekiah didn't get mad at Micah for telling him the truth. How come you want to kill me? And I think that's a pretty good point, because what we're seeing from Micah is a condemnation, and he will not be quiet. And we're going to see that in these first two chapters emphasized. And he's being told to be quiet. Don't you talk about that. And he's not going to do it because the people needed to know those things. So when people say, well, Micah, who really knows who Micah is? And it's just a story. Jeremiah goes back. He's down the road, and he turns back to events that happened in Micah's life to bring home the point that how come you treat me this way? God's people didn't do it back there in Hezekiah's day. And I think he has a good point. When you read the book, you'll see movements in the book. These first two chapters we're looking at, and the idea of judgment coming near, and we'll see that into chapter 3. In chapters 4 and 5, foreseen, meaning in the future, blessings are declared. That's where we're going to see Bethlehem is where your governor is going to come from. He's going to lead the people. And there's blessings that we see will be fulfilled in the Messiah. And then repentance is repeated in the sense of appealing to them to repent before they go off into the same situation as God's people did earlier. And so there you have your 7 chapters that are unfolding, but they move from one main point to another and under this category. And I think it fits very well to understand it from that standpoint. Question number 1, how does the earth, so he's not speaking just about Jerusalem, he's speaking about the earth, and maybe some part of Jerusalem, but we think of the earth as in reference to this planet that we live in, and more so because God is not coming from this planet. He's coming from his holy temple, and it's not Jerusalem. And so in these first 2 verses, well, as he presents himself as being a Moreshite, being from Moresh Gath suburbs, we'll get into that in the latter part of chapter 1. But he says, hear ye peoples, all of you, hearken, O earth, all you peoples, plural, not my people, you peoples, earth. Here is something that he is stressing for all mankind to pay attention to, and it's God. He says, let the Lord Jehovah be witness against you, not for you, not with you, against you. Earth you're sinful. That includes Israel, that includes Judah. It's a condemnation of the earth with the people for what they have done. So the Lord is in his holy temple. Oh, that's Jerusalem. His holy temple is, he's in his holy temple in the Psalms when he's in heaven. And that was just a representation of his authority. His holy temple is in heaven. And how is it characterized? Holy. Set apart from sin. Set apart from the way of the world. Set apart from man's wisdom. He is totally separated unto himself and his own glory. God is. And he's in his, not his temple, it's in his holy temple. And therefore, how does the earth react when the Lord came down? See, he came down from Jerusalem. No, he came down from heaven to earth. And how does the earth react in his presence? It's melting. But I say his presence. What is Micah telling you? His feet. Because what is he doing to the earth? The mountains shall melt under him. The valleys shall be cleft as wax before the fire, as waters that are poured down a steep place. For the transgression of Jacob and all of this, and for the sins of the house of Israel, and transgressions of the people. He comes down in verse 3 from his place and come down, and he treads upon the high places of the earth. And so he sets it out in mountains, and he sets it before us as valleys. What happens to the mountains? Under his feet. They shall be melted under him. Brazen feet we see in Revelation of God. Fire, bringing forth judgment upon the people. And so the mountains that are so high, they indeed are going to melt under him. And the valleys shall be what? I thought you already have a cleavage in a valley. And now they're going to have a cleft? Mountains are brought down. The valley's going to dig a little deeper because what's pouring down? It's like wax. It's like wax, like water, going down a steep place in verse 4. So the imagery is two things of natural phenomenon that have been set forth in this. There's volcano and earthquakes. And God's treading upon the earth is that the mountains and wax and idea of being melted, volcanic action is we kind of visualize. Micah is speaking of nature here. And the cleaving of the valleys, they're cleft, is because the ground, even where the valleys are located, they're breaking up. That's earthquakes. That's not literal earthquakes and literal volcanoes, and that's where God is doing that. He's coming down in judgment. But that if the same place where a volcano was, we had a bunch of earthquakes, would that be a tragedy? And fire is coming down upon the vicinity and pouring out like water, and it's coming as wax. That's the burning feet of judgment of God. And where is he coming from? Heaven. He's coming from heaven. So Micah begins his prophecy denouncing the sins of the earth. Now he gets to his people. And because God comes down in judgment, and this is where we live, and we're not going to be able to escape that. So again, it's just the imagery we'll see in the New Testament. And one of the beautiful things about studying specific verses and getting these verses in our mind is that you pick up the prophets are so familiar, you'll see it over and over and over again, of the pictures of God's judgment. And no wonder we see the New Testament imagery. So, why do we have that? That's really different. It's because the Old Testament was preparing people for the glory of God. We see it in some places, so the judgment of God. And when you see that, you'll pick up on a lot of things that take place, because a lot of times it's not just something new out of ground is just that he uses imagery and wax and fire and earthquakes and the cleaving of the valleys that they're not going to be able to avoid. What crime had Samaria committed, and what was the consequence? Why is this happening? It's falling down like water, wax falling through water like on a steep place. For the transgression of Jacob is all this. And so how he defines Jacob is in the idea of the northern kingdom, Samaria, and then he speaks also about Jerusalem. Jerusalem would be talking about the southern kingdom, the kingdom that comprised Judah and Benjamin. So he covers all of his people under Jacob. So that's exactly right. But it's the northern kingdom, Samaria. And so we pick up on this question, what crime did Samaria commit? And we see this over and over again. We just call it idolatry. And notice how you will be, just the imagery that will pick up on this. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what are the high places of Judah? Are they not Jerusalem? Yeah, Jerusalem's a high place, but it's there. They're doing the high places because there's idolatry. So listen to this. Therefore I will make Samaria as a heap of the field and as places for planting vineyards. That sounds like prosperity. That sounds like this is a good thing. Well, in other places it is. This context, no. It's like this heap of buildings, we're having to move it away so we can build a new building. And we realize that's been a catastrophe. That's where people died. When walls came down and as a pancake. Oh, it's cleaned off and we'll have a beautiful garden here. That's what we're talking about. Because this is destruction that has happened and it's been wiped clean. Samaria, this prosperous city, is being wiped clean in this imagery as a heap of a field, as places for planting vineyard, and I will pour down the stones thereof into the valley. After all, they've been cleft. The earth is being cleft. There's room for those to fall down in there, and I will uncover the foundation thereof. I'm bringing to what the sin is. And so what do we pick up in verse 7? You said, well, the sin of Samaria was idolatry. Yeah, and you know why you're right? All her graven images shall be beaten to pieces. That's why the valley imagery is not pleasant. It's beaten to pieces, and her hires shall be burned with fire. What do you know about idolatry from the perspective of God? How does he look at idolatry? Harlotry. Who is playing the prostitute? Samaria. Who is getting the tribute money? She's being used to buy favors from Balaam. And Israel's the prostitute. It's just for hire. And that's how God, how many times we've seen God looks upon that as spiritual harlotry. And what was Hosea's point of view that God made him do? You go marry a woman of harlotry, whoredom, because you'll see how I feel when my people go after other gods. Hosea just keeps coming to your mind. Micah's hitting it from another standpoint, but he just says it's for hire. Now listen to this. And all her hires shall be burned with fire. It's an idolatry too. And all her idols, well, about time you got playing with that. Just one way of saying it, one way or another. These are synonyms. Harlotry, high places, has been taken place, graven images, and then the idolatry. It says, all of her idols will I lay desolate, for of the hire of a harlot hath she gathered them. That's why I've said, Israel, you're the prostitute. You got money in order to gain favor. And you did that by worshiping Balaam. But what does he say next? Harlotry she hath gathered them and unto the hire of a harlot shall they return. Now you're forced to say, okay, what does it mean? I've gathered them, and then they're going, the hire of a harlot, they're going to return. You know they're not going to succeed by going off into idolatry. Their place is going to be like where you plant vineyards in a heap of a field. And they'll be taken to captivity. And if I'm right about the first part, then it just follows the second part. Because you're going to look to a nation that is giving you protection, and you get the hire of, you receive the hire of a harlot, and then that same hire is going to return because it's going to go to another country that's going to conquer you. It will be another harlotry nation, another nation that is going to take you. It's going to return to them. You gathered the blessing. Well, protect us, or protect us, or protect us. You're not going to protect you. Assyria is coming. Judah, Babylon is going to come. But what did those countries serve? Idols. And it'll just be another form of harlotry from God's perspective. So you gather it, and it doesn't help you any. It returns. But you're empty. You're not going to escape the judgment of God. That was the consequence of what was going to happen. And it says, and unto the hire of a harlot shall they return. And so all of this gaining favor with the nations, they would try to gain favor with Egypt. Early on, Ahaz tries to gain favor with Tiglath-Pileser. You see that in the readings that we have. He even said, oh, I like that idol. And they try to bring that back to Judah. And all of those things are happening. Micah speaking against that, and of how their idolatry is bringing them down. Any comments you'd like to add to that? Harlotry, hire, and how it is just good. God, how do you look at unfaithfulness? Harlotry. We've seen with Hosea, you're not very grateful for what I've done for you. Oh, grow up, God. You want to tell God to grow up? You're self-centered, God. He's the creator of all things. And sometimes I read my Bible and say, well, God, you were self-centered? And he just, as if he said, yeah, what about it? It's me. It's about me. And the glory I have is saving sinners like you. Be quiet. Stay. I'm in the holy temple. Be still and know that I'm your God. And Jesus says, I want people to go to heaven to see the glory that you had with me before the world was. Jesus, is that why you want us to go to heaven to see your glory? That's exactly right. It's exactly right. To see the glory of God is the greatest blessing you'll ever have. And you see it in salvation. We're going to see it face to face. And we'll realize that all of our existence was to manifest, and all of the stars, all of the planets that we're working real hard to get to Mars, and all those things that bring glory to men, they are already been in place because they manifest the glory of God. Just go through your Bible and see how much glory of God is emphasized. And it changes your perspective a lot of times. That I want to get in tune for that. What have said? All men have fallen short of the glory of God when they sinned. Why? Because that's exactly the truth. He created us to manifest His glory. And we fell from that. That's how bad sin is. Sin is not a sickness. It's not a weakness. And it may be considered that way in imagery. But how many people say sin is that I'm falling short of the glory of God? We don't think of that because we think God is not that selfish like I might be. He's not selfish. That's the fact of manifesting glory and all of creation. It's that fact that His glory is seen and He wants it to be seen. And in Christ, He wants us to see that that's where His glory is in salvation. Well, they're going to realized that only God could have saved them. And he's what kind of temple? He's in a holy temple. And we're going to see in these first 3 chapters, they didn't live up to that. Why were the people of Israel to cut off their hair? Because they are. All of a sudden, beginning with verse 8 through the remainder of the chapter, and we'll pick up at verse 16, make thee, as some versions have a parenthesis, O Zion. So that's why I'm talking about the people of God, Zion. Make thee bald and cut off thy hair for the children of thy delight. Enlarge thy baldness as the vulture or eagle, for they are gone into captivity from thee. That's the point. We've been looking at, you'll go for hire, your wages, your money that you receive to receive blessings, they'll return to another kingdom and full of idolatry. You're going into captivity. So that's the main thought that we're seeing here. So here's the lamentation. And so why is it that as people, they were to cut their hair, be bald like a vulture? It's shame connected with going into captivity. And a lot of times there was nakedness, not that they were completely naked, but they were stripped of their outer clothes. There was a sense, there goes the prisoners. That's like we put a jumpsuit on somebody, but there, Isaiah talked about the buttocks being exposed, going off into captivity. That was a shame to expose the nakedness, especially in the context, we are a defeated people. And here we go off in chains with, our bodies being exposed. That brings shame to us. And cutting off the hair was part of lamenting and of their situation of sadness. We see it beginning with verse 8, I will lament, I will wail, I'll go stripped and naked. Not totally nude, but stripped and naked of clothes that it only left show that you're a conquered people. So there's shame connected with that, but there's lamentation and sadness because we've been conquered. So you have 10 cities here that are mentioned. Did you find them on a map? But teacher, you didn't do it, so I'm not going to have to do it. You're right, I didn't do it, but I studied them. And you know what you find is that he has a play on words. And of course, Zion is the last one because he's speaking about his people. But here are places, and some of them, like Gath, verse 10. We know that's a Philistine stronghold. We know where it's located on a map. And what we see is that west and southwest primarily of Jerusalem, you have these Philistine cities. You got Lachish, well-known city. In fact, Lachish was so probably that the Assyrian king, he made it a big deal when he took Lachish. There's a bas relief, it's in the various museums where Sennacherib inscribed when he took Lachish. That's the Assyrian king. That's Sennacherib that will come from these cities and try to take Jerusalem. He'll come even to the gate and try to take Jerusalem. And in the days of Hezekiah, that's part of these days of Micah. And he wasn't able to take it because God intervened. But he took these other places. And so you get a picture, for example, Gath. What do you think? If there's a play on words, and you grant me that, tell me what you think the word Gath means. What's it? Tell it not in Gath. Tell it not in Gath. What do you think? Opposite time. What do you think it might mean? Tell it not in Gath. Gath was the tell it city. It was that you tell. And here's the overthrow, and he uses the opposite in order to describe, tell it not in Gath. And I think it's important to understand that when we look at these, sometimes it becomes a proverb. It becomes something that's in place. For example, tell it not in Gath. Let's just go back to the times of David. Let's go way back there. In 1 Samuel, I got a number, 1 Samuel 1 and verse 20. maybe up. 2 Samuel 1 and verse 20. Because this is the time in which David learns of the battle of Gilboa, and Saul and Jonathan have been killed in battle. So what does verse 20 say? Tell it not in Gath. Because Gath is a tell-it city. But here's something so horrible that's happened, tell it not. It's the idea of destruction coming upon them. So you begin to look at, after Gath, and it's Beth-le-Aphrah, having rolled myself in the dust. That means the dust. It's a city, it means dust. Pass away, O inhabitant of Shaphar, in nakedness and shame. And Shaphar was the idea of being set forth as fortunate. Well, no, it's nakedness and shame. You're not fortunate anymore. And all through here, he speaks about what the words meant for the city, and there's a play on that. I want you to see verse 13. Bind the chariot to the swift steed. Now, Lachish was known, in this case, for its fine horses. And we'll see a lot of times in the prophets where God says horses and chariots, that's not where your power is. And that's where they would appeal to people like in Egypt in order to have that type of armor and army and so forth. And he said, you tie them up and Lachish, because that's not going to help you. And she was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion, appealing to horses and chariots instead of God. And the physical things of this world can have better appeal than God's word and how we ought to serve him. Man's wisdom, man's thinking can take us away from God. But they thought, hey, we get a chariot, you get your horses that are well respected in Lachish, use that name for that purpose. Thou shalt give a parting gift to Moresh Gath. We talked about this, the idea of giving a gift. Well, this is a gift given, but somebody else is going to enjoy the blessings of it. For it says, the houses of Asib shall be deceitful. It has to be, they don't tell the idea that they're not going to tell the truth. They're supposed to tell the truth. That's what it's supposed to be. And the kings of Israel, and they're not going to tell the truth. And also, like Adullam was a cave for beasts. And so in verse 15, I will bring thee, O inhabitant of Mareshah, him that shall possess thee. The glory of Israel shall become like a beast cave, like a bat cave. Well, that's not very glorious. That's the whole point. You'll be like Adullam. Those words meant something, and now he's saying something opposite that's connected with those cities. And while we might not know where all of them are located, a lot of them were located west of Jerusalem. And when the Assyrians had conquered, or they defeated Egypt, they're on their way to Jerusalem. They come from the west. And they had come from the northeast. And they had conquered the foes that are supposed to be strong, and where God's people had appealed to them for protection. He even appealed to Tiglath-Pileser, Assyrian, for protection. They give you your hire, and then it returns to them, because we're going to take you. We're going to defeat you. And that's what happens. So Zion goes off in shame. It should not be that way. But part of that is the cutting of the hair. There's the lamentation that indeed is taking place. All right? Let's move on. Number 4. Who are those described in chapter 2 and verse 1? Now, this is not easy, but if you'll follow the thinking, I think you could come to a pretty solid point, and it just makes it's enriching to get to that point. But realize it's very difficult, and we may not really understand it all, but it makes sense. Woe to them that devise iniquity, and this is not the one, but we'll get to it in this section. Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. Just think about this for a moment. Why do you go to bed at night we're to get our rest. Some of you are young, you don't need a lot of rest. Some are getting older, and you can't sleep long enough. You wake up too much. But you should get your 7 hours in. I learned that you're supposed to have that. Well, 6 is not good enough, and 9's too much, old people. You go 9 hours, you're too much. 7 hours is supposed to be the deal. So you try to get your rest. But when you go there, you just turn off all those blue lights and turn off all your things. That's why you had been sleeping very well. And turn that TV off. Dark, and you keep your room real cool. You keep it cool. Because your body heats up, it's going to wake you up. So you do all these things that they tell you to do, and you're sitting there, how am I going to get even with that guy? You spend all that time that should be for rest and for health, and all you do is roll over in your mind, how am I going to get them? How am I going to get even? How am I going to conquer them? When the morning is light, they practice it. They devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. It's supposed to be a place of rest. And when the morning is light, they practice it, because it is in their power, in their hand. I got the power. I will use it. Now, who in the world is that? They covet fields, and then they seize them. I want that field, then I think I'll go get it. And you go get it. And they take them away. They oppress a man in his house, even a man in his heritage. It's going to affect his lineage and his children. Who is that? They have authority because they had the power, didn't they? And they're looking at ways to get richer. They're looking at ways to gain more control. As one author says, they controlled the real estate, and therefore they controlled things, and they wanted more and more, and they would take people's houses. They'll be taking, well, before we get through Micah, they'll be taking women's houses, and that's what is happening. So their place of authority, those are your rulers. And he says, therefore, thus saith Jehovah, behold, against this family do I devise evil, from which ye shall not remove your necks, neither shall you walk holy. What is going to happen to them when those things occur? What's going to happen is that I'm coming. God is speaking here through Micah. I'm coming, and you're not going to be able to get your head out of the neck that is going to bind you. You're going to go off into captivity. And what you've done to be haughty against them, it's going to come back upon you. Therefore, thus said Jehovah, because against this family do I devise an evil, these people, from which ye shall not remove your necks, neither shall you walk haughtily, for it is an evil time. And that day shall they take up a parable against you. And so you lament with a doleful lamentation and say, we are utterly ruined. He changeth the portion of my people. How doth he remove it from me? To the rebellious he divided our fields. So we conquered, and now we give it up. There's again the hired that's going back to a nation that will defeat you. And therefore thus said thou shalt have none that shall cast the line by lot in the assembly of Jehovah. You're not going to put, here's a standard of justice and so forth. You're not going to do that. You're going off into captivity as well. But it shows you the leaders are involved in being the ones that are the problem here. Who is telling the prophets not to prophesy in verse 6? This is where it can get a little tricky. But let's say, and this is where studying the other prophets help, and our time is limited. Let's just lay out here what I think is the point he's making. So many times were the prophets who spoke the truth that said evil's coming. We've seen that with a lot of prophets. Micah's one of them. Isaiah's, Jeremiah's going to be there. they don't want them to speak because all they say is negative things. All they say is, like Jeremiah, all he does is talk about destruction. And we know that even in the old prophets, they speak about the glories that are going to happen later. But let's look at this. Prophesy ye not, thus they prophesy. They shall not prophesy to these, reproaches shall not depart. So I'm saying, they tell you to don't prophesy. Why? Because reproaches, you're saying you've sinned and this is what's happening, they shall not depart. It's not going to change anything. Shall it be said, O house of Jacob, is the spirit of Jehovah straitened? So I think here could be the leaders, because we'll see in Micah, they've been paying off the prophets to speak what they want to hear. That's when you talk about having teachers after the itching of your ears and paying people to, I'm paying you, and you just tell us good things. That's been happening a long time. And so that's what they're saying. They use the false prophets to denounce the true prophets. Now, the true prophet is speaking, is what I say. And this just flows when you see it that way. Is the Spirit of Jehovah straitened? Is it restricted that you can just, we talk about the straight and narrow way. We mean it's restricted. That's this word. He says, is the Spirit of Jehovah straitened? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him that walketh uprightly? What I'm denouncing is sin. Why don't you get online with God? It will be good. It's good. But how many people don't think that's good when they don't want to hear what the truth is? And that's what's happening. But of late my people is risen up as an enemy. You strip the robe from off the garment from those that pass securely as men averse from war. I can't walk in my streets without you coveting these things and taking them from me. The women of my people you cast out from their pleasant houses. From their young children you take away my glory forever. Arise ye and depart, for this is not your resting place, because of the uncleanness that destroyeth, even with a grievous destruction. If a man walketh in the spirit of falsehood, if a man walking in the spirit of falsehood do lie, saying, I will prophesy unto thee of wine and strong drink, he shall even be the prophet of this people. Case closed. He's nailing the people, their sins. And the false prophets are telling the true prophets, shut up. Don't want to hear that. Is God's Spirit straightened that when you command it, then the people that teach the truth are going to shut up? No. And some will. But God's people won't. And this is the point. Who's telling the prophets not to prophesy? I think it's the rulers who paid off the false prophets, and they're saying, hey, we're prophets. You don't speak that stuff. It doesn't change anything. And here's what I want us to learn from. What principle, question number 6, what principle should strengthen your heart? Strengthen your heart regarding God's truth, even when it's hard to take. What principle is that? If you do the truth, you will profit from the truth. I mean, it's when you're going against it, is when trouble comes. And that's just good. That's a good principle to live by. I appreciate people say, you stepped on my toes this morning, thank you. I don't get much of that, but I've had that because they want to do right, and you've exposed that, and thank you. Thank you. And that's the way it ought to be, as we're trying to do right. We make mistakes, we get offline. And if we have somebody at least going to teach the truth to us, that's what we need. Even when it's hard to take, that's something I need to think about. And you should not rebel against that. What they do, they want to shut up. Shut the messenger up, and we'll continue to live like we want to, and everything's going to be okay. It's not okay. And that's probably a sobering place to stop. Any questions or comments you might have before we go? All right. Next time, we'll get number 7. Thank you.